Well, welcome to the final day of the Cassetta Symposium for 2023. Our first paper or talk is entitled Converging Concepts in Art in Public and Private Collections by Bruce Shackelford. Bruce is the Texas History Curator for the Witte Museum. He's been here for over 24 years, curating dozens of exhibitions dealing with the history of the American West and Texas art. He was curator for the creation of the Robert J. and Helen C. Clayburgh South Texas History Center at the Witte. Shackelford's written several books, his most recent being King Ranch, A Legacy in Art for Texas A&M Press. Shackelford started working on the PBS television series Antiques Roadshow for WGBH, and 26 seasons sponsored by the Harvard Public Television, and he's participated, as I said, in 26 seasons. Please welcome Bruce Shackelford.
Thank you all for having me, and thanks Howard Taylor for doing such a great job of this. This is an unusual organization because of who it brings together. It brings together collectors, institutions, dealers, the whole deal, in an institutional place, which is the best place to talk. And that's an unusual thing these days. Things are changing fast. I usually talk about cows and being on the rear end of a dust storm, walking to Kansas or Nebraska or Wyoming. So this is a little bit different subject. I have talked about it with friends, but as far as a public presentation, you're going to get the first one, and we'll see if it's worth pursuing, because it's definitely a part of what's happening in our culture. Why do we do this? There's a lot of reasons. I think it's genetically wired into us. We were hunter-gatherers. We like to bring things into our surroundings. How far does that go back? Neanderthals, and what are they, 300,000 years ago to 57,000 years ago? So those things you find, they're in their space. We like symbolic memories in our surroundings. Texans especially, and I'm one of the big ones, we like to bring the outdoors into our interior space. And I love that. I mean, and I'm glad it continues. It's what keeps people going, like Noe Perez and his great paintings. Paintings preserve history. The greatest example of that is Cecilia Steinfeld's book, Art for History's Sake. Connects it all, helps pull it together, and uses paintings to document history, which is a lot of what I do. It preserves culture. It shows cultural things you wouldn't see any other way. And for some people, it's a compulsion. There's no question at all. For some people, it's for financial gain. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. It depends on what level you start collecting in the evolution of the history of a subject. And that's another complicated discussion, and I may hit on it a little bit if people are interested. But here's why I think we do it. It's magic, and it really is. I think Billy Joe Shaver, who prior to shooting not a friend, critic, but he pretty well said it. And we take colored pigment and put it on a support to create imagery. That's a pretty unusual thing. You don't see any other species doing it. We take a lump of clay and it ends up a ceramic or a bronze like the Borglum out here in the garden. Something of our existence in our culture. And it isn't just in the West, it's worldwide this goes on. And we combine human-altered materials, glass, tanned hides, prepared plants to make jewelry, textiles, baskets, all kind of different things that just the preparation alone is extremely complicated. Think of making a basket in the Southwest with Apaches at Chiricahua. That's an extremely complex procedure that in a large piece can take a year. So it's something that's very different that we as a species do. Well, what does that mean? Until the mid-50s, art was pretty well defined in the West and for Western European, Russian culture. It was pretty clear what that was. That's over, forget it. Probably won't ever go back to that. What am I talking about? There you go. That was art. It was formal sculpture, and it was paintings, and mainly oil paintings. I mean, drawings, lesser stuff. You wanted big A art, as they used to say. So what changed? The millennials. Now, the millennial is an era-defining word. Somehow it's now defines a thought process, but if you notice, these millennials compared to the millennials now, these are all pale, male, and stale people, right? That's who the millennials now criticize. Am I wrong? No, I don't think so. So it's an ongoing thing. Back to Texas. We do love to bring the outdoors inside. And that's what this is all about. And this is a great example of that by a great artist who's from Texas. I would say these artworks hold their own with any landscape paintings in the world. I think they're that strong. And these are fairly large paintings. There's another one. This is probably my favorite underdog. And this is an example of documentation, story, and context. This was on his easel when he died in 1922. It's a big painting. Full-blown impressionist, the height of his career, height of his style, and the top subject he could have ever chosen. We ended up with it from the family. It's very, very important in addition to being beautiful, but all the information that goes with it makes it even more important. And I'm going to talk about that more and more. Context. Places and people. Portraits, people's homes, where they work, all subjects for artworks in Texas. And it's extensive and exhaustive. It was talked about yesterday, and it will be talked about from now on, and it has been in the past here. That is a Gentil of Matamoros, and there's the people, and there's where they lived. And that's a memory. That's a memory that somebody wanted to capture. They didn't want to capture it with photography, which I consider an art form as well. They wanted a painting of it. And they got him to do it. What's changed? A lot. Let's start with cell phones. Everybody in here, for the most part, remembers being without a cell phone because they didn't exist. I was one of the early guys that had one. I had one in the late 80s, and it was powerful. It was one of those you would probably say is dangerous today. Cell phone I'm carrying now is probably, 0.5 of a watt. The one I had then was 6 watts. I could get on top of a mountain and call California with skip signal. It was crazy. But it changed my ability to communicate personally. Then the internet. Here at the Witte, we had early email just on site, not off site. We couldn't send it to anybody else. We could communicate on site. So all of a sudden, communication stepped up in how fast you could do it. Then email and the internet went to everybody, and it just changed the whole game. We can get computer access to records, information, images, and exhibits across the world like that. But it's not the real thing. You're not looking at texture. You're not looking at exact color. You're not looking at reflectance off a painting. You're not looking at shadows on a sculpture. You're not looking at materials and what something's made of. To me, that's critical. It's one thing to see Guernica in a book. When I saw Guernica as a painting in real life, whoa, there's something. And it's just not the same. People have readjusted their thinking to where not only is it enough, artwork is specifically made for computers and computer perception. So that's changing things a lot. And now for the rest of the story. I may not know what art is, but I know what I like. And that's kind of what I've come to as the bottom line. I have things on the wall. My wife and I get things we want to live with, that we want to be friends with. In some cases, these are things, somebody says, wow, where did you get that Robert Wood? I inherited it. It was painted the year I was born for my grandfather. That's been a part of my life since the beginning. So, of course, when things were divvied up years and years ago when he passed, I wanted that painting. It's something I see every day. I know where it was painted, the whole thing. Have I written it down? No. So if somebody else ends up with that painting, they won't know a thing. They'll just go, wow, that's a great Robert Wood. That's an issue. Write it down, put it on the back, put it somewhere. If you know about this stuff, document it and document what you know. People collect everything. Judy's talk yesterday about what the art changes in the 50s and the 60s, that's very, very important because the perception of what art is changed. When we talk about art now, I know when I talk with Michael Grauer, we don't talk about great saddle makers. We talk about the art of saddle making. We talk about the art of spur making. And people collect it all. Jewelry, pottery, you name it. So the whole level of what art is changed radically. And who perceives what, it's personal. It's very personal. And that's part of what's going on. Why does a guy buy a T-Rex skeleton? Whole, real, partial? It's sculpture in his living room. Now, who would have thought? I mean, I've always been interested in fossils. Hell, I grew up in West Texas. You go out and you find this stuff. You know, you're going to shoot dove and then you see an arrowhead and miss a flight because you're bent down to pick up that arrowhead. I mean, you know, if you grew up in West Texas, that's the kind of thing that happened. And that's what's happened with collecting. What defines this stuff? It's something we do here at the Witte we think is incredibly important, and we've done it not just recently as a response, we've done it for many decades. I would say every exhibit I have done has a huge component of context because that defines what we're looking at and why we're looking at it usually. And it's the role of an artifact in the culture that produced it, socially, technically, spiritually, and is usually closely connected with a narrative, a story. The biggest change in the art world today is the story. And not just the art world, in marketing of precious things of all kinds. Repatriation, that's part of the story. And it's going to be a bigger part of the story all the time. Who does it belong to and where did it come from? I tried to apply this to the Southwest, but I could apply this worldwide, and I'm familiar with what's going on worldwide. This is what's called an Ahayuda. It's a Zuni war god. And I'm going to read these numbers because they're very interesting to begin with. These were owned by collectors and institutions from Andy Warhol to the Brooklyn Museum, Denver Art Museum, and that's only to name a few. I think the Met had one. Brooklyn Museum had 13. Denver Art Museum had 6. In the 70s, the Zuni, they wondered where these things were going. That's the context of a Zuni war god. That's where it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be like that in a museum, in somebody's parlor on a plexiglass stand. It's supposed to be here. It has a life. It has a spiritual association. It has a number of beliefs that go with it, and they're very important to the Zuni. Somebody was going to Denver Art Museum or one of the institutions. They said, man, they got all these Zuni war gods. They go back to Zuni. What's going on? Tribal members were taking them and selling them. That's theft. Dealers were stealing them and selling them. Again, it's theft. These are owned by the tribe. They're not owned by individuals. It's theft. It ended up in court. The Zuni won, and they got them all back, all that could be found. There's a few in Europe that the laws don't apply over there. They apply here, and they've been unable to get them back unless they can convince an institution or a collector to give them back to the Zuni. But this is the classic example of repatriation, and much deserved repatriation. What provides context, and how reliable is the documentation? This is what I do. It's what Michael does. Judy. It's something we all work with. Catherine is an expert researcher and bails us out of trouble all the time with this. This is about documentation. It can be a letter, it can be a photograph, which we've looked at some this weekend. You know how when you watch the Antiques Roadshow and they always say, wow, it's in the original box. Yeah? Does that matter? Well, we'll see. Historic research of a specific artifact from creation to ownership is important, and documentation of that. Factory records. Some of the things we consider extremely collectible have factory records. Each object was basically handmade in that factory and put together from parts and embellished, but there are factory records. Institutions often have extensive records and archival documentation for artwork that are in private hands, and that has happened on Antiques Roadshow, where you all may remember a Mexico painting. Yeah, Rivera came in the roadshow. It was missing. Had been missing since it was first photographed in the 30s. Well, a dealer sold it. It was considered to be the beginning of his career as a muralist. Well, it had been hanging in a closet here in San Antonio with the family who bought it from his dealers when Rivera was alive in Mexico. So there's no repatriation problem. There's nothing like that. But all of a sudden, this appears, and it's been documented over half a century ago, now almost a century ago, by scholars. So, and it is still privately owned, but it is on public exhibition. Here's a piece. This is one of my favorite things at the Witte. If you don't think that sombrero is a piece of art, I'll argue with you all day. It was made by Tardin in Paris. They also had a shop in Mexico City. They were considered to be the greatest hat makers in the world in the 19th century. This was made for Thomas Allen and came to the Witte from his family. Well, incredible information, really great, and documentation on the piece. Yes, all that is silver-bound thread. But guess what else we got? Remember the box part? Hello, guys, it was still in the box. That's the box that came from Tardan with a sombrero in it, then shipped from Veracruz to Boston. All of it's on there. I mean, what a great trail. And what looks like terrible conservation, well, I'm sorry, that was like the 1940s. You know, they just wanted the box to stay together instead of throw it away, and thank goodness they did. And that box was shipped by American Express. So it's even better. So what about the artwork besides being a great hat? I got to looking. One of my favorite paintings by Alan, and Alan is an incredibly important artist related to Texas, and you know, I mean, the great genius about this whole subject, Ron Tyler, can tell you only too well about this guy's paintings, and there are a number of artists who painted in Texas, some of which are incredibly important nationally, but we've never found their Texas paintings. So keep looking. I got to looking at this painting. See that guy right there? What's he got on his head? He's wearing that sombrero. I think that's Thomas Allen. I think he inserted himself in that painting when he was painting it. He's standing behind everybody else, kind of, this really isn't me. Yeah, I think it is. And that's San Antonio downtown behind San Fernando Cathedral. The narrative, real or otherwise, is it a compelling narrative like the hat, or is it a story? Is it verifiable? Is it something that you heard from grandpa or grandma? Does it matter? Yeah, it does. And used to, oral history and so-called folk history was readily dismissed by scholars. That's stopped. If you do that, you're taking a step backwards. It may not be verifiable, but whether it's verifiable or not, it's important information, and it should be considered a part of that object's history and narrative. And this is especially true with non-traditional Western art. You think the story's not important? Let me tell you, it is. Those guys that paid for that, they can tell you it is. Because that was all started with a story and a suspicion, a suspect documentation. Witte looks like a little lump of clay. Remember, I'm just an old lump of clay, you know. This is this big. What is it? Does it look familiar? It's Theodore Roosevelt on the Mountain by Gutzon Borglum. Well, how do you know that? Because his daughter gave it to us, that's how. So all of a sudden, this becomes a key artifact. It's a little molded piece of stuff that he did right over here. It's not like he did it a long way away. His daughter lived on the ranch in Beeville. He moved and did Mount Rushmore and included exactly that much later, and she gave it to us. Colt single action. Firearms are highly collective, as are all weapons. Some have more handwork than others. This is one in the Witte. This is Ainsworth inspected, first-year production, Colt single action, cavalry model. Ainsworth was a percussion inspector. So that little mark by him on that gun changes the game, changes the value, the importance, and the history of this pistol. Does it change it enough? Well, there's some stories that are more important. This one, same gun, manufactured much later, 1880, 7 years later. What's the deal with this? I saw this gun in a roadside attraction in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, in the early 1970s. And I've known where it's been since it changed ownership from that time continually. I know where this gun's been. So what's the deal? This is a story. How important's the story? $5.5 million important. That's how important the story is. It's the highest selling firearm in the history of the world. It's in the U.S. Thank goodness. What's the story? Pat Garrett shot Billy the Kid at Maxwell's Ranch with this pistol. Verifiable by serial number from Pat Garrett's hand and continued through his family. So that's another story that you can't overlook these things. They're terribly important. Artifacts speak. And like the Ainsworth mark on that Colt, you just have to look and listen and be educated enough and educate yourself enough to know what you're looking at. I bet you know where that is, and I bet you know who that is. That little lady was about 80 years old, had health issues, didn't think she was going to show up. It's one of the few prearranged roadshow viewings. They submitted in advance. We get about 200 submissions a year, and the producers go through and pick things and throw them out to us and say, is this worth doing? I said, yes. This one was canceled. They threw it in the garbage. Not the piece, but the application. They said, no, we're not interested. This is the most important thing historically I've ever done on the show. It's a little boy's shirt. So what? That little boy was her great-great-grandfather. He was a Kiowa captive. This family was Spanish colonial. They had never left. They had a trading post, and when I say a trading post, it was a trading house, bigger than this, on the Santa Fe Trail coming out of St. Joseph, Missouri. Those were huge warehouses. They were government-backed. The government gave people money to set this up. And so it became a very important thing. That little boy was brought in by a tribal band wearing this shirt. They needed food. It was 1852. The world was in chaos for the Plains people. They said, okay, well, here's what food we can give you. What are you going to give us? They said, we don't have anything. We'll give you this little boy. He was a little Anglo kid, little blonde-headed, blue-eyed captive. So this family took him in. He lived with them till he died. He worked in the local economy very successfully, married what would have been his cousin if he was blood relative, but it was one of the family members, and lived there his whole life well into the 20th century. And this was kept packed in the bottom of a trunk to remember this story. Thank goodness the family kept up with the story. It's probably documented. Catherine could probably do it. I can't, but we can probably track this kid down in the census gaps between 1850, 1860, 1870. We can probably go through Mora County and find him. We don't have the time on the road show. We've got 10 minutes. Look at it. That's bison hide. So that means it was during the days of the bison hunts. It was when the plains were still going. It's sinew sewn. The beads are of two types. Both of them predate 1850. It's a very specific kind of beadwork. It's beaded on both sides. This thing weighs like 15 pounds because it's all glass. And Catherine took these pictures for WGBH Boston. And there's the two of us after we finished, and the shirt has vanished. I said that I believed it was a historic, it was a national treasure in terms of the history of the Southwest, unquestionably. They didn't know whether they wanted to take it to a museum. They didn't know what they wanted to do, sell it. So what's it worth? I don't know, $250,000, $300,000? A lot. A lot more because of the story, and it's a verifiable story. We don't know what's happened to it. If it had hit the market, if somebody had bought it, we would all know. It's a small world, and we would have found out relatively fast. I think they probably just went home and put it away and said, let's think about it. This is what I get asked all the time. I want to give it to a museum. Well, does a museum want it, and which ones? Because our standards, our levels of interest, our levels of what we're going to show the public as an institution are different from a private individual. There's issues with this too. We're all running out of space. There's no more room. This museum's 1926, one of the oldest museums in Texas. Where are you going to put it all? Is it worth saving? Is there still interest? Space issues, that's the biggest. British Museum is fixing to put a ban on taking in all archaeological material found in the UK. The spectacular bronze helmet that was sold at auction and was not taken in by the British Museum, unfortunately. They've run out of space. They don't have any place to put this. Raiders of the Lost Ark, where you see the hallways full of cabinets and shelves, that's us. That's every large institution in this country, and we're a large institution. And it's difficult, it's costly. There's moratoriums going on all over the world on this stuff. And there's more planned. And we've got to decide how we're going to do with it, and the public needs to tell us how they want it dealt with as well. Because you guys are coming to these institutions. You're part of the interest. We can't just make these general reactions and statements and say, this is what we're going to do. Relevance has changed radically. Do people even want to see paintings anymore? I don't know. Thank goodness in Texas they do, but we'll see. Trust in taxes, there's been accusations of collusion. Taxes are changing. Used to, family foundations would buy great art collections scattered among the heirs, put it in their houses, they'd enjoy it, and then they'd donate it to a museum as a tax write-off. And they would usually plan in advance with an institution to decide who got it. So it was a done deal. It was just a question of when either somebody got tired of it and wanted it in another home, or wanted it in an institution, or when the taxes were right for it. So that's another issue. So these are the things we're dealing with. This is how it crosses over between the public and the private. And my favorite slide of all times, the wonky donkey, one-eyed, one-legged, winking, blinking wonky donkey. That's kind of, we don't know. We're staggering through this, trying to figure it out just like everybody else. Thank you guys for having me here. If you want to read a book that talks about different perceptions of art, read The Songlines by a Brit named Bruce Chatwin. It was written, I believe, in the early 70s. Staggering about how Aboriginal people look at their artwork as opposed to us, and how they utilize their living history and their ancient history in their lives. Also, just for those of you who are interested with the Zuni thing, Frank Hamilton Cushing wrote Zuni Bread Stuff, and that painting is at the Philbrook, and Rudy Wunderlich, the dealer, said it was the greatest American painting in existence. So the Southwest has always had people interested. Thank you, guys, and if you have any questions, just ask me.